introduce Margaret Kober. Margaret lives in Virginia, works in Maryland, and she's with the FDA, and you are the same as me today, meeting her for the first time. And so far, so good, Margaret. And so please help me in welcoming Margaret.
How's the sound? Good. Good. You can hear me. I'm going to start my timer. Or not. So good morning. I am delighted to be here. When I was asked to speak, I thought, oh, I love technicians, and here's why. 38 years working in pharmacy practice at the retail setting in places like Walgreens. I love you. Thank you. I would not have been able to last without you. And I just want to say, I found a lot of joy through the years watching your profession develop. And I love the topic of this conference about frontiers, right? It's only going to get better. So bravo to you. And a little bit about myself. I go by Margie Kober. My pronouns are she and her. And I am originally from Rhode Island, moved to Virginia, and have worked at the FDA now a little over 23 years. So if you notice, did not start practicing pharmacy as a 6-year-old. There was a lot of overlap. So I would work at FDA, and then I'd work nights and weekends at the pharmacy. It's interesting to me because our focus at FDA is public health, right? Large quantities of people may be able to benefit from the work that I do, but then I get to the pharmacy and I'm talking to a patient who's actually using a product I worked on and listening to their experience, which is perhaps very different than what we had envisioned. One example is Forteo. Anyone familiar with that? I don't know where you practice, so don't be offended if I say, does anybody know what that is? Forteo is a drug for osteoporosis. Not something we would use perhaps right off the bat because it does have some issues. First of all, it's injectable, and people with osteoporosis tend to be elderly, and so maybe manipulating an injection might be not the easiest thing for them to do. But what really concerned me as a fairly new person at the FDA, I was, oh, let's not do any harm, right? The early non-clinical studies showed that it caused osteosarcoma in rats, and not just like, oh, latent osteosarcoma. These were palpable tumors, and I saw them. So you think, well, do we want to make this available to the American public if we don't know what that means to humans? Like, it happens in rats, does it mean it happens in humans? It's not good that it happens in rats. Maybe the rat's not a good model. No way you could figure that out unless a lot of people took the drug, because osteosarcoma just doesn't happen that often, and we certainly, even if we were going to have a product that doubled the risk, it's still a very small risk. So it got approved, and the way things get approved, that's sort of one of the topics we're going to talk about here. There are a lot of people involved, but at the end of the day, it's one person making that decision. And so the one person making the decision on Forteo was to put it on the market with some guardrails and some post-marketing studies required to see what happens. And there it was. Years later, I have a point to this story. Years later, I'm at the pharmacy, and this little old lady comes up with a cane, and she's picking up her Forteo, which luckily, thank you, technician, had actually stored it in the refrigerator. So I go to the refrigerator to get her prescription, and I look and I say, okay, this is an opportunity for a conversation. So I said, can you tell me a little bit about your experience with this? And she started crying. And I thought, I hope she doesn't say what I think she's going to say. And she said, it has changed my life. I can walk. She uses a cane, but I can get out of bed. I have a life now that I didn't have before. And I was like, oh, okay, that is good. And possibly had you informed people and there is some labeling language in there about the risk, but if people really understood the risk, would they still take it? And this was my opportunity to learn, yeah, they will sometimes. Sometimes they will put up with tremendous risk. And I don't want to call out any specific drug in terms of maybe this is not the right approach, but Optivo, seen the commercials, a chance to live a longer life. That survival claim is pretty common in the oncology world, but you have to ask yourself, what kind of life is it? If it's a life that people would want to live, that's great. If it keeps you alive so you can go to your son's wedding, great. But if it, there was another drug where the survival was in hospital on a respirator. I don't know. So explaining to the public what the risks are and what they could mean, and then, quite frankly, stepping back and letting people decide their own health care. And you can tell now, I'll talk a little bit about where I'm coming from. I work with women's health, so yeah, I'm about stepping back at a certain point and letting people decide. But I also work with a number of other divisions. I work with dermatology, I work with ophthalmology, do a little bit of oncology, a lot of rheumatology, so shout out to the rheumatology experts in the audience. So just a broad overview, but primarily in the space of drugs and biologics, and we'll talk about the difference between the two, representing the Office of New Drugs. Also do a fair amount of outreach, so I go around the country because I love to talk and I love my job, so I love to talk about my job. But happy to hear questions. There's plenty of time built in, and if anything I say strikes you as wrong, do speak up. I don't have a prize for you, but I love to be challenged, and we can have that conversation. So we'll get into it. The first thing we're going to talk about is the types of FDA products. I almost called this slide, "Not everything in a drugstore is a drug." A lot of them are, but a lot of them aren't. And unfortunately, with marketing being the way it is, it's very hard to distinguish sometimes. So hopefully, one of the things you'll take away from this session is the ability to tell what is regulated as a drug and therefore meets one standard and what is not and therefore meets a lesser standard. I'm going to call it a lesser standard, and we'll talk about why that is. So drugs can be either prescription or non-prescription. What we used to call, when I was coming up, over-the-counter. We use that phrase less now. Why do we use that phrase less? Because some of the things that are over-the-counter are actually behind the counter. And we could talk for another 2 hours on whether or not that's a good idea. I get it. But, I think, yeah, I've been there. Just like the key to the ladies' room. Why am I carrying this key?
Why do I have to be the gatekeeper of
Everything. But yeah, a lot of it may be because of theft, right? So, but I can tell you, I worked on Plan B a lot through many cycles, and the concept of having that accessible to the people who need it, particularly vulnerable people who need it, right? Like part of our mission in public health is, of course, to care for all Americans, but also to especially keep in mind the most vulnerable among us. Who might those be? Well, it's not someone who had, regular consensual sex with another adult. Probably someone who's not in that category. Anyway, I digress. So the idea was make it available so that there's access. Ideally, that access is in the house, right? So advanced provision, have it on hand. When my daughter went off to college, she went off to college with a case of Plan B because she was going to live in a dorm. What better way to make friends? But, so behind the counter, over the counter, we just call it non-prescription. Now, for the most part, drugs are regulated through an approval process, and that is like the highest standard that is. That means that The folks who want to market those products have to show us through evidence and data, and sometimes some legal arguments, that their product is reasonably safe and effective when used according to the labeling. Notice that is not safe and effective in every circumstance. So we don't, for instance, regulate off-label use. And it is amazing to me, because I see some of the safety reports on these things, just because something's on the market doesn't mean that you should necessarily use it in every circumstance for everything. But there are some exceptions. So some non-prescription products are approved, meaning they went through a process. Most of those are RX to OTC switch. So it used to be a prescription product, now it's an OTC product. Bonus points, no prize, if you can shout out an example of that. Voltaren, I heard. All good examples. My favorite is Nicorette, because that's how old I am. I used to work at a pharmacy in the Pentagon, and the number of people that worked at the Pentagon at that time who needed Nicorette was astounding. Lots and lots, that's all we did. So that's drugs, and we'll talk a little more. We're going to kind of peel back the onion. But the next quick category is biologics. And knowing the difference between a biologic and a drug is tricky, because all the biologics so far, wink, wink, nod, nod, are prescription only, kept in the pharmacy, most of them in the refrigerator. So how do you know which is which? Well, if you look at the chemistry, you'll know. Biologics tend to be very large molecules, therefore very hard to produce. But the real kicker is they are produced by living organisms. So there's a cell line. So biologics include things like Humira, Enbrel, a lot of rheumatology, a lot of the rheumatology drugs. And so biologics can be thought of as a sort of a subcategory of drugs. Same standard in terms of they need to provide lots and lots of evidence, particularly in the manufacturing and facilities space. So very similar standards. One of the ways I tell people, how can you tell you've got a biologic? Well, if it ends in MAB, adalimumab, denosumab, those sorts of things, definitely biologics. There are others that don't end in MAB, but MAB stands for monoclonal antibody, so that's a clue. One of my colleagues routinely, when she was talking about a biologic, would just take the first three letters, and that's what it was. So we worked together on upadacitinib. Wasn't a biologic, but you get the drift. If it's hard to pronounce, it's probably a biologic. Different than devices. So devices run the gamut from toothbrushes to pacemakers. And there's a whole lot in between there. Device manufacturers and people who want to bring them to market, typically that's the same entity, but not always. Sometimes you have somebody makes it and somebody else markets it. They tend to be smaller companies. They tend to be a little less aware of the regulations, and so they tend to get into a little more trouble sometimes, just in general. Different devices are regulated in different manners, so we'll talk a little bit about what that looks like. But if you think, do I use a medical device? I hope you do, because it includes toothbrushes. So first, I hope you have teeth, and second, I hope you clean. The next category, foods and dietary supplements. Foods, there is a definition, but I think we kind of all know it when we see it, right? Dietary supplements, a little more complicated. And so we'll talk about how they're regulated, how they got to be, how that law got passed, which I think is fascinating, but maybe no one else does because they're not from DC. And what kinds of things you should look out for in the dietary supplement world, because this is getting into the area of consumer beware. And we'll just leave that there. Cosmetics, because it's part of what we regulate. It's not in our name. My colleagues in FIDS one time, they had T-shirts made up that said, we put the F in FDA. So FDA is Food and Drug Administration, but it also includes devices and cosmetics. Animal drugs. So what we're talking about here are not drugs made out of animals. There are some, or made from animal types of products. Does anybody know what Premarin, how that name came about? Oh, it's a great Jeopardy question. Pregnant mare's urine. Yeah, ooh, that's why it's coated. There's so much coating on it. They take a female horse and pretty much keep it pregnant. You can YouTube this. This is public knowledge. It's horrifying for the horse. And they collect the urine and they purify it and they extract all this gamish of hormones, and they call it conjugated estrogens. We don't know what in that gamish actually makes the product work, and the product does work, like there's no question. Probably the product works because it's dosed so high it would have to, but really hard then to come out with a generic Premarin because we don't really know what's in it and what does it. So we just look at the whole gamish. So that is not an animal drug because we don't give Premarin to hogs that have hot flashes. It's used for women who have hot flashes. But so what I'm talking about are drugs that we give to animals. Think antibiotics. And again, we could debate whether or not we should. Is there a question?
Or also like the flea and tick
Yes,
medications. Okay.
indeed. Good example. That sort of thing. But yeah, things we give to animals, including euthanasia products, which now we're using on people sometimes too. And then finally, we have tobacco products, the new kids on the block at FDA. I don't think they're even on the same campus as the rest of us, but they are now, I know, they're off in their own world. That includes things that you smoke and other smokeless products. So I guess I don't know the whole breadth of this. It's the one center I don't interact with ever. But snuff, chew, chaw. There are also combination products. So you can take a variety of these. I don't think there are any tobacco drug combinations because remember, tobacco and cannabis are different things altogether. But you could have a combination of a drug and a biologic. I love when different talks come together. So the last speaker was talking about targeted oncology treatment. There's a lot of instances where we have a drug that kills cancer, and we attach it to a monoclonal antibody that binds to the tumor site. And so that is how precision medicine gets done in the oncology world. Lots and lots of examples of drugs and devices, things like prefilled syringes, auto-injectors, pens, inhalers, lots and lots of devices. In the surgical realm, you get into things like when you do spinal surgery, you put the thing in the cage, and then you put the cage in the person, and you close it up. So all different kinds of combination products. So, of course, because there are different types of products, there's different ways they get to the market, and there's different laws that enable the agency to determine whether something should get to the market. So this is not a bunch of us sitting in a room figuring out whether something's a good idea or not. There's actually guardrails in place. We cannot, for instance, and quite frankly, I don't want to, take cost into account. So many of you may remember the somewhat controversial approval of an Alzheimer's drug that hasn't really done very well because it costs so much that people can't afford it. And so there's that intersection also between the folks who pay for drugs and the folks who say the drugs should be available. Well, quite frankly, the drugs are not available if they are not accessible. And by accessible, we have to consider that that might also include economically accessible. So the standard at FDA, again, for approval is safe and effective when used according to the approved labeling. The standard at Medicare and Medicaid services is reasonable and necessary. So a lot of these drugs maybe to CMS don't seem reasonable. So different, we're not DEA, we're not CMS, we're our own little agency. We all work for the same people, but we're not always on the same page. We're getting a little better at that, but not there yet. So what are these laws? Well, the first, my favorite, is the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, the FDCA. That includes regulations for drugs, but it also includes devices, biologics, some biologics, the therapeutic biologics. There are also biologic regs, and the enabling statute for that is the Public Health Service Act, so there's the enabling legislation, these acts, right? The FDCA, the PHS Act. Then the agency takes those laws that Congress has given us, very often with unfunded mandates, but given us, and then we have to figure out how are we going to implement this, and how would people go about meeting these standards, and that's how regulations are born. So regulations carry the same weight as laws, but they come from the agency, not Congress. So one of the previous speakers and I should have brought mine. Mine's green, but his purple copy of the CFR, those are the Code of Federal Regulations pertaining to his agency. Ours are, so I don't remember what number his is, but ours are in the 2100 series. But those, we have to abide by them too, right? So it's not just the burden on the people who want to market products, but it's the burden on us, like this is how we have to judge things. And even if we think, well, I think I should be able to take this other thing into account. No, you can't. And there have been a lot of legal actions about this, where the agency has appeared to be arbitrary and capricious, and you can't do that. So another law, perhaps my least favorite, the Dietary Supplement and Health Education Act, and this is the one that came about as a result of, I'm not going to say single-handedly, but Orrin Hatch out of Utah, a Republican senator there, had a lot to do with this, because there were a lot of dietary supplement marketers and manufacturers in Utah. So he was doing a good job representing his state. But what this established was that if a dietary supplement product met certain standards, then they didn't have to show that they were either safe or effective.
Why?
Because there were a lot of manufacturers in Utah. That's a guess. But anyway, that's the rule of the land now. So, you can see how the folks who have to deal with these types of products, and I'm not usually one of them, but it makes it difficult to hold people to standards. One of the things I do get involved with, so far we don't have an answer, but what's a prenatal vitamin? Is it a drug? Certainly looks like it, because I bet if you work in a retail pharmacy and you go to the shelf, it says RX only, and that means it's a drug product, right? It's a prescription drug. Nope. There are no approved prenatal vitamins.
Really?
None.
There's a lot of OTC.
I know.
I know.
And those OTC ones better not say RX only. So is it could be a drug. The fact that it's not approved doesn't mean it's not a drug. There were a lot of unapproved drugs. Up until 1997, levothyroxine was not approved. Now, I'm thinking, hopefully some of you were alive then, so it hasn't been that long. But yeah, so it could be a drug. I would argue, depending on the claims, it might be. If it's got folic acid and the folic acid is there to prevent birth defects, wouldn't that be a drug claim? I think it would. Diagnose, prevent, treat, or cure disease, it would be one of those prevent things. Could be what they now call a medical food. And it's not just prenatal vitamins. There are some products that are used for schizophrenia that are being marketed as medical foods. There were a lot of folks interested in a specific diet for autistic or people on the autism spectrum. So it's a burgeoning field because we don't know what to do with it. So maybe it's not as costly to develop those products as it would be to develop a drug. It's just a theory. The Tobacco Control Act, the new kid on the block when it comes to laws, is just what it sounds like. It's just tobacco. We don't get into any other areas with that law. And I like to say it's like the camel's nose under the tent. It doesn't do everything that perhaps its proponents wanted it to do, but it was a pretty good first shot. Now, all of these laws are subject to amendments, meaning every time something bad happens, Congress does something to react to that. So the FDCA Act has been amended a lot. The very first one, and it wasn't actually called FDCA, but it was the precursor. All a product had to show to be on the market was that it was not misbranded or adulterated. So if it was what it says it was, that was all it took. Didn't have to be safe, didn't have to be effective, didn't even have to taste good. It just had to be what it said it was. And then sulfanilamide happened. Sulfanilamide is an antibiotic. It's in the sulfa, as you would imagine, sulfa class. Early on, this was like 38. I was not alive. Sulfanilamide, there was one product that had a diluent in it that unfortunately was deadly. And so lots of people died. And because lots of people died, Congress did something to amend that previous law to now require it has to not be misbranded or adulterated, but it also has to be safe. So that was pretty huge. In 1951, still not alive yet, that was the year that RX only became a thing. Before that, there was no prescription only. You could literally go into a pharmacy and sometimes a barber shop and get whatever you wanted. You'd talk to the pharmacist, who very often back then they called him doc. There were no PharmDs in 1951, but that was like where you went rather than go to a doctor. Now, those of you who still work in the community, maybe you still see this phenomenon. Well, people come to the pharmacy counter and bang on it and ask a question. And my favorite response in a certain situation was, "Oh, that's not a pharmacy question, that's a doctor question. You know, why are you here?" I had somebody one time bring me a baggie, and I'm looking at the bag like, "What's this?" It was a louse, and I'm like, "Oh yeah, I think you need to go." But that was the standard back then. Whatever you needed. Pardon?
We had brought in a paper towel.
A paper towel.
Yeah.
Seems like it would escape better from that.
Yeah.
I digress. So, yeah, 51 introduced the concept that certain products probably required a learned intermediary, and that is a legal standard. So if you couldn't use the product without somebody smarter than you telling you how to do it and whether you even should. That's the concept of a learned intermediary. And so now we have RX and OTC, or non-prescription. Questions so far? Okay, feel free to shout out. I'm very informal. So diving a little deeper, the FDCA, what does this do? What does it mean? Well, it gives FDA the authority to ensure that, and I'm going to stop right there because that's actually the legal term, but quite frankly, we can't ensure any of this. There's so many of them and so few of us. We do what we can, and it is our job, but we could not possibly go out and inspect everything that should be inspected and then go back the next day to see if they put something back in place that was taken out of place. So yeah, it's a goal, but nothing is 100%. And why do I mention that to this audience? You're on the front lines. You may be the only thing that stands between a patient getting something that could harm them and not. So you should take that pretty seriously, right? Like, if you notice, and maybe it's not you that intercedes, because some of these conversations are difficult, but you're checking somebody out, and a lot of times at the pharmacy, they should be only getting prescriptions and take the rest of the stuff up front, but a lot of times they don't, and you're not going to have that conversation because it's going to take you longer than to just check it out. If they're combining things that shouldn't be combined, it might be an opportunity to have a conversation, right? I worked at a place where if anybody was buying cigarettes, we were told, take the time to counsel them on smoking cessation. I don't have a pretty face, but I don't want it to get any uglier. But it is an opportunity. I mean, it sounds like a great idea, right? Like, that's an opportunity. But this was a rural place in Virginia. Everybody had a gun. I worked the Saturday night shift. I am not having those conversations. So what are we supposed to ensure? Foods are pure and wholesome. I would argue that if you go into almost any grocery store, a lot of it isn't either of those things. You're all familiar with shop around the edges. So your fruits and your vegetables, probably a safer bet than your Spam. No offense, Hormel. Are they in Iowa? Okay, sorry. Way to tailor the audience.
You're breaking a Hawaiian's heart.
But again, people know that's processed foods. Right? Like, it's wholesome in that if you had nothing but Spam and water, could you live? I'm not going to try it, but probably. Safe to eat. Safe is a relative term, right? There are certainly products that we know, whether they come out with recently, everything could cause cancer, which is probably true. Probably not water, but depends on what tap you're getting it from. But yeah, safe to eat, produced under sanitary conditions. Now, this is the kicker, because even the stuff on the outside of the grocery store, like on the perimeter, look at the E. coli outbreaks we have. Salmonella, good example. Like, there's just so many farms and so few inspectors. And I sound like I'm whining, and I'm not, but the reality is that the American public is not willing to fund the type of program that would ensure. So here we are where we are. Wash your vegetables. Probably not a good idea. So wash them, not watch them. Well, you could watch them. If you grow your own, that's even better. And wash. Drugs, including animal drugs and devices, are safe and effective for their intended uses. So again, according to that labeling. Cosmetics are safe and made from appropriate ingredients. And I don't think that appropriate is a great word to use in a law, because appropriate is very subjective. But there you have it. And again, a good one. All labeling packaging is truthful, informative, and not deceptive. And we'll talk a little bit about what that looks like in the dietary supplement world in a little bit. The PHS Act for biologics, again, it's an approval process, so people have to send us information. It gives folks a license to distribute. That license can be taken away and has been. It can be suspended or revoked. There are manufacturing standards and they are legion. And why is that? Because if there's a problem with a biologic, it's in that person for a really long time. Some of these things you inject every 6 months, so that's a problem. And then there's also labeling regulations. DSHEA, that Dietary Supplement Health Education Act, applies only to oral products. I bet you will be able to go into any drugstore and find something that is called a dietary supplement, but it's a cream, a lotion, a suppository. They're not dietary supplements. They're marketed as dietary supplements. They're unlawfully marketed as dietary supplements unless they're oral. Now, again, so many out there. So few people doing anything about it. So the people who do something about these sorts of things take a risk approach. So this being there, first of all, is it harming people? Other than separating people from their well-earned money, most of this stuff isn't. A lot of this stuff is, and we do take action. There were quite a few products, and can unfortunately continue to be, because it's like whack-a-mole, dietary supplements marketed for men's health, which is a dietary supplement claim, right? That's not curing anything, we're just supporting your health. Undisclosed tadalafil. Tadalafil, as many of you know, active ingredient in Cialis. RX product for a reason, not without its safety issues, I won't say problems, but certainly something you want to be aware of, right? Like if you've got, again, if somebody is picking up a prescription for nitroglycerin tablets and Viagra, Cialis, Levitra, any of those, opportunity to talk. So interestingly enough, the meal replacement folks weren't included in this. So that's things like, I think Slim Fast is one where you drink this stuff instead of having a real meal and it helps you lose weight or not. Not a dietary supplement. So what are the rules? There's 2. The labeling must be truthful. It's not approved, so we don't have to like vet that language before it's out there. They can't lie. But they can push the envelope. And then they also have to carry this disclaimer. And I think most of you have probably seen this and not understood what it meant. But the disclaimer is this statement, meaning supports men's health, has not been evaluated by the FDA. This product is not intended to diagnose, treat, cure, or prevent any disease. The actual law says mitigate, but apparently the DSHEA framers didn't think that people would understand what mitigate meant. But that's it. That's your dietary supplement regulation right there. Cosmetics, again, FDCA Act. And now, we did say we would get to this definition. Cosmetics are articles intended to be rubbed, poured, sprinkled, sprayed on, introduced into, or otherwise applied to the human body for cleansing, beautifying, promoting attractiveness, or altering the appearance. So pretty wild, wild west, right? We know for sure it's foundation, it's mascara. but it could also be other things. A single product could be both a cosmetic and a drug. So shampoo, cosmetic, cleansing. But if it's anti-dandruff shampoo, then it's also a drug. And that's why it's got cosmetic labeling and it's got drug labeling on the same product, Head and Shoulders. Look at a bottle next time you're in the store. Pre-market approval is not required. So again, no evidence coming in. They don't have to show that they're safe. Effective, that would be, in my opinion, for me, nothing's effective. But pre-market approval is not required unless it's a color additive. So you have to wonder, and I have no answer to this, you have to wonder why. Why color additives? But that's the law. Animal drugs, also regulated under FDCA, have to be proven safe and effective if they are given to major species. And we'll see what those major species are in just a moment. But some of them are not actually going through the full approval process, and they're just conditionally approved for marketing. Those tend to be for minor species, or if for a major species, it doesn't carry quite as much risk. So, and then for minor species where there's virtually no risk, those are indexed. So this isn't even something FDA gets involved in. This is the experts, and the experts are usually from the industry that makes these products, come up with some standards of their own. So that's what indexed means. So what are your major species? There they are: horses, dogs, cats, pigs, chickens, turkeys, and cattle. So pretty much two groups: things we spend a lot of time with and things we eat. But this law was written a long time ago, so maybe that's changed. Like, I know a lot of people, not personally, but a lot of people keep ferrets. They spend a lot of time, maybe we should worry about we're giving what's in ferret food or what. Birds, yeah. It's interesting that you bring up birds. I was able to witness, I wasn't involved in the conversation, sort of a mini debate between the then commissioner of the FDA and the then director of the CDC over whether or not it was a great idea to have chickens in your backyard. So the FDA guy was like, yeah, I have chickens. And the CDC guy is like, oh, you shouldn't. They should not, they carry disease, and they're going back and forth. So even, these, well, bird flu and apparently a host of other problems, according to the CDC guy. But
I can see both sides, though.
yeah, but I guess it's a,
The eggs, yeah.
the eggs are good
Like, a source of food, but also a source of.
and fresh, you know where they came from. But yeah, so I guess the point, because there's a point to every story here, it might not be obvious, but even really smart people can disagree about these things. And that's okay, that's healthy. I love when we don't have a unanimous decision on an approval. Not that it's a vote, it's not a vote, but you kind of go around the table and So if it's not a major species, it's a minor species, and therefore subject to a different level of evidence. And finally, the Tobacco Control Act, that new kid on the block. Here's the provisions. Restricts sales to folks who are 21 or older, used to be 18. We'll just leave that there. There are warnings on smokeless products about how it can cause mouth cancer, I guess. Modified risk claims must be supported by evidence. So here's something where sort of first crack at pre-market approval kinds of activities. So this is why you don't see these claims anymore, because nobody's doing that type of submission of data. So you don't see light, you don't see low, you don't see mild. There used to be a product called Marlboro Lights. There's not a product called Marlboro Lights anymore. There's that same product, Marlboro Gold. They just gave it color instead of an adjective. So now the difference is Marlboro Red, Marlboro Gold. I don't know that we accomplished that much. Yeah.
Does this act apply to products that contain nicotine, but the nicotine is not derived from tobacco?
Does not. Excellent. So,
Because we have a chain in Omaha of like gas stations. Gas stations here are not allowed to sell certain vaping products, but they kind of get around it because all of their vaping products have nicotine that is not derived from tobacco. So I've been told.
whew. Yeah. So, thank you for that example. No, I mean, you laugh, but
Might want to add that to your agenda.
yeah, I know. Here's another loophole. But yeah, like, there are smart people I work with, and then there are lots of smart people out there saying, well, and 'tis a principle of law that that which is not prohibited is permitted. Now, there are instances, and I don't think there should be, who cares what I think, but there are instances where something's permitted, but only up to a certain point. So can you grow, I don't know, I don't know what a reasonable amount of cannabis is. Can you grow a ton at a time? Can you have 5 plants? Can you have, like, there are states that are grappling whether there should be limits. But if you remember that principle that's, if it's not permitted, if it's not prohibited, it's permitted. Right. If something's legal, just because you do a lot of it, it makes it illegal. So things to think about. Notice here there is no safety provision in the Tobacco Control Act. I think the understanding there is that there's no safe tobacco product. So that's just like stipulated. None of them are safe. What can we do to mitigate the risk? And, oh yes.
On that tobacco one, since there's been a lot of information and a lot of discussions about the medical marijuana or the states regulating the sale of marijuana, that would probably fall under that, the tobacco rule, or?
Nope, because cannabis and tobacco are different. And, almost everywhere I go around the country, no matter the topic of the talk, cannabis is an issue. And I wish I had answers to the cannabis question. We don't know what cannabis is. We know it's not tobacco. We know in certain circumstances it could be a drug. We're starting to finally query clinical trial participants on cannabis use. Because it's out there, and people are using it, and we shouldn't pretend that they're not, and we should factor that in. One of the products I work on, one of the indications I work on regularly is endometriosis. Endometriosis is a painful condition that occurs primarily in young women. Of course they're going to self-medicate. Can we just agree that that's going to happen? Right. And then when you're designing a clinical trial, capture that information so that when people improve, how do you measure that? Well, if they don't use as much cannabis, maybe that's a sign that it's working. If they're using more cannabis, maybe it's a sign it's not working. But at least, balance the users from the non-users so that they're not all in the placebo group or not. So something to consider. But yeah, there are a lot of folks. There's an organization called the Food Drug Law Institute, which is basically a bunch of lawyers who think about these things, and even they don't know. I mean, it's hilarious to listen to them talk, because they're like, oh, it's dietary supplement if it's an edible. Okay. My diet doesn't include cannabis. Some people's diet might, like they put it in brownies, but it's not a dietary supplement if it's not in a normal diet. But what's normal? Funny. Normal actually stands, the acronym is National Organization for the Reform of Marijuana Laws. A segue there. Finally, I'm going to say a lesser burden to industry is the oversight of food. This is the category where there's so many different products and so many different marketers and so many different, there's a lot of food. So we count on the industry to sort of regulate themselves. Now, there are third parties that are accredited to do inspections. There are still inspectors, there's no doubt. There's inspectors who go out to farms and find things, and then recalls happen. But there's also these third parties that are hired to do so. Authorizations, real quick on this, it's just in an emergency, we need to get things done sooner rather than later. An authorization can turn into an approval, but think of your COVID-19 vaccines were a good example. Clearances refer to devices. Not all devices need to be approved. The high-risk ones do, your pacemakers, that sort of thing. But if it's not too risky, then all it has to be is equivalent to a device already on the market. So things like condoms, they're not approved. One would argue that why would you want to put a bigger burden if no good can come of it? It's just like this other thing. And finally, what I consider the gold standard, and others do as well, new drugs, things that have not been marketed before, have to show safety, effectiveness, and quality. Generic drugs do not have to show that they're safe and effective. They have to show that they're bioequivalent to something that is. So it's still an approval process. The quality standards are the same, but the approval standards are not. And then high-risk devices do have to show both safety and effectiveness. That's why you have clinical trials for new hip implants and that sort of thing. So that is the end of my talk. Do we have challenged questions loaded or?
Does it want to be on the next slide?
I didn't include them in the deck because I didn't want to give the answers. Do we have to have them or can I? Okay. Did everybody have a good time? That's the challenge question. But thank you. I think I have 3 minutes. Happy to take questions. If you have something you'd like to ask and you don't want to ask it in front of a room full of people, I'm going to kind of hang for a little bit. Pretty approachable. I usually have my email address, but if you want it, you got a notepad, margaret.kober@fda.hhs.gov. If you shoot me an email, I'm happy to respond. Can't give you non-proprietary information, can't tell you when the next Viagra is going to be approved, because we'll all go to jail.
Can you repeat the email address one more time?
Certainly, because I'm a fast talker. Margaret, M-A-R-G-A-R-E-T, .kober, and that's K-O-B-E-R, @fda.hhs.gov.
I think we have one question.
I did not see, yes, one question.
Now, with FDA-approved diagnoses and off-label use, how does that work where they get the off-label use as to an FDA-approved diagnosis?
Good question. There's a process for everything. So we approve a product for a specific use or multiple uses, and it's used off-label, and the company that has that marketing authorization says, oh, if we get this off-label use approved, it'll be paid for by insurance, and then we'll sell more of it. So they come in with another application. It's a supplement. So they can rely on the original application for things like the non-clinical stuff, the chemistry stuff, and they just have to show that it actually works for that use. What we are seeing, and we actually have published guidance on this now, I didn't publish it, real-world evidence as a stand-in for clinical trial evidence. So stay tuned, yeah. Slippery slope, right? But sometimes that's appropriate. But yeah, that's a great question. There is a mechanism to do that. I don't want to eat into somebody
We're gonna go ahead and
else's.
maybe you can meet with her afterwards.
Yeah, I want to be respectful of the next.
So, thank you, Margaret, very much.
You're welcome.